It's my pleasure to introduce you to Brooks Kolb, who is an architecture designer. We had this idea for creating spaces. I don't know if anybody went to the Flower and Garden Show in February, and there was a lot of different booths with how to create a space and refresh your space. And it gave us an idea of like, how can we bring that today to give ideas for next year or for the fall. So Brooks is actually a landscape architecture and does creating spaces. He's also the VP of the Seattle Arts Foundation and the founding member of the Volunteer Park Trust, founding member of that. So with my great pleasure, I'd like to introduce you to Brooks. Brooks.
I have this big, heavy book bag with me because I'm going to show you a couple of books while we talk about this. And let's see, I also have a handout. In case any of you are interested in hearing from me in the future and hearing what I'm up to, for example, mass emails or something, I'm going to just pass these out and you could put your name and email address if you're interested, but you don't have to if you're not. So, put some over here. And over here. All right, so tonight I'd like to talk to you about creating spaces, the landscape architect's approach to garden design. Let's see how this works. Just learn. Okay, here we go. So lots of people design gardens. Homeowners design gardens, gardeners design gardens, landscape contractors design gardens, landscape maintenance contractors design gardens. There's a lot of different people who design gardens. And of course, landscape architects design gardens. So how do landscape architects design gardens that's different from the other people? Well, primarily, we design gardens as spaces. We think of the gardens primarily as a space, a physical space, before we think of it as a botanical curiosity or anything else. And a space means an outdoor room. A garden space is an outdoor room. Outdoor rooms are defined by walls, a floor, and a ceiling, and the ceiling is an open ceiling, the sky. A garden is always a landscape, but a landscape is not always a garden. So what is the difference? I think of a landscape as generally larger than a garden, and the other thing about a landscape in general is you don't necessarily know where the edges are, whereas with a garden, you're always or nearly always aware of the walls, which are the boundaries of the space. Now, the other thing about gardens is that they are primarily intended for relaxing and enjoying the presence of flora and fauna. So this is a picture of a garden I designed in the Inverness neighborhood in Seattle, and it was published in this book. Well, the article about it and that photo was published in this book. Oops. New Landscape Ideas That Work by Julia Moyer Meservy. And the thing is, Julia Meservy approached me many years ago and asked me to send her a bunch of photos of my work in view of the idea that she might include some of my gardens in her book. And out of all the hundreds of images that I sent her, she picked not this image, but a similar one. The reason it wasn't this image is that this was a professional photograph that was subsequently taken. And there was no accident as to why she chose this picture. It's because it shows an outdoor room that is intended as an outdoor dining room and an outdoor living room. And so it's very clearly designed as it's a programmed space, you might say. It's programmed for dining and for outdoor living. A garden is also a place of refuge. This is another garden design I did, and it's very similar in the idea that seating is at the center of the space, but in this case, the seating is not so much about outdoor dining and outdoor living and socializing, but more about repose and about relaxing. Now, those two images I showed you are of gardens that are flat, and we tend to think of gardens as being flat, but of course many gardens, especially in the Seattle area, are sloping. So what happens when you design a sloping garden? What happens is the idea of what is an outdoor room gets a little bit more complex. So in this image, for example, there's three different tiers. There's an upper tier, a central tier, and a lower tier. And those tiers, you can think of each one of them as a separate outdoor room within a larger outdoor room. But still the same idea holds, that it's an outdoor room. When the slopes get steeper, that's even more true. There's more separation between the various sub-outdoor rooms, or rooms within rooms, as it were. Now with that, I want to take you on a quick tour, hopefully a very brief tour, of garden design history. In the beginning, there was the Garden of Eden, as we all know. Well, at the same time, not at the same time as the Garden of Eden, but very early on in the 400 BC, there were Persian gardens. And the Persian gardens were called paradises, which is, of course, the Persian word for what we call paradise. So the Persian gardens, the word paradises in Persian, it actually meant an enclosure. And so built into the idea of paradise itself was the idea that it's enclosed with walls. There were four rivers in many of the Persian gardens, which then became Islamic gardens because the Arabs took over Persia. So here is a Persian carpet from circa 1700, which is property of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. But it's very interesting because it clearly shows, I don't know if there's a laser pointer on this thing. Oops. No, that just turned it off. Anyway, you can see in the center, there is a central motif, which is a water feature. And then there's that X pattern or cross pattern. Those are four rivers that emanate from the center of the garden. And there's a wall around the exterior of the garden, and all four parterre gardens that are on the sides of those rivers, they're all exactly the same. So that's what I call quadrilateral symmetry. And that quadrilateral symmetry really informed all of the garden design that occurred in subsequent ages. So for example, here is on the right, the court of the lions at the Alhambra in Spain. And you can see the four rivers have turned into runnels because, of course, it's a very arid climate, and so it's not rivers, but it's still that same concept that there are two intersecting axes, an x-axis and a y-axis, and they are symbolically the four rivers. The image on the left is a Mughal garden from India of the 17th century. So I mentioned the x-axis and the y-axis. You probably all have heard about gardens being axial, that such and such a garden is axial. What does that mean, really? Well, it means there are center lines, or lines that go through the space in a very mathematical way, and they intersect at the center. And so, for example, here is a courtyard, it's just my diagram of a typical medieval cloister garden. You have a baptismal font at the center, and you have four different parterres that are exactly the same on all four sides of it. And you've got the four paths leading to the baptismal font, and those are arrayed on the x-axis and the y-axis. And there's the colonnade, or cloister, where you walk around the garden. And here's a picture of what one of those gardens looks like from a medieval garden in Spain. Then, as history advanced, as it does, we get into the period of the Renaissance. And all of a sudden, there's a big jump in scale from these small courtyard gardens that were dominant in the Middle Ages to these much larger gardens. And because Italy is hilly, we see that slopes are then incorporated into the garden design. which is an important thing to talk about. But what I want to talk about right now is how the lower terrace maintains that same quadrilateral symmetry that we've seen before. And what they did that was so interesting was they reversed it so that the four rivers are no longer four rivers, there are four bridges, and the four parterres that we saw around the center have become pools. So they basically reversed it. There was an even bigger jump in scale in the 17th century in France with a really great landscape designer, Henri Lenotre, who designed both this garden, Vaux-le-Vicomte, and Versailles. Now, as you can see, it's a much larger garden, but again, you've got the two intersecting axes, and there's a fountain in the center. One axis becomes the pools, the other axis is the main walkway to and from the palace. And there's a very interesting story about this because it was designed and built, it was built for Nicolas Fouquet, who was Louis XIV's finance minister. And so when it was built, Nicolas Fouquet threw a big housewarming party, you might say, and he invited Louis XIV. And there were fireworks, and there were parades, and there were horses all over the place, and beautiful costumes, and so on and so forth. Well, Louis XIV was not pleased because his finance minister was living in more opulent surroundings than he was. So he had Fouquet thrown into prison, and some people think that he was the prisoner in the Iron Mask that you've heard about. So as a result, Louis XIV could only turn around and build Versailles, which was even bigger than Vaux-le-Vicomte. And as giant as it is, you'll notice that one thing that's still incorporated in the design is the x-axis and the y-axis, which have now become the grand canals of Versailles. Now, we go from there to a reaction against it, a very strong reaction against it in the 18th century. This is the English landscape park movement, which is what really made me fall in love with landscape architecture to begin with. There was a complete reaction against all the formalism, the x-axis and the y-axis and so forth. And so you can see that there's nothing formal about this at all. The bridge is off-center to the left, the temple in the background is off-center to the right, and there is this very serpentine, naturalistic shaped pool. And there was a very famous poem lake. There's a very famous poem by Alexander Pope in which he condemned the style of Henri Lenotre, and he said, every alley has a brother, meaning it's boring because you have one row of trees balanced by another row of trees, very axial, very symmetrical. The design of that landscape, which was Stourhead, one of the best examples of the 18th century English landscape park movement, was inspired by the paintings of Claude Lorrain and Poussin, both of the 17th century, and they were painting landscapes of what they thought were classical Roman landscapes. Again, there's no symmetry in those, and that really was exciting to the British. Now, jump forward to the 19th century, and in this country we have the great Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the father of and coined the term landscape architecture. One of the many things that made him a genius was that he was able to incorporate both the axial formal elements that we saw in most of the centuries of garden design, and then the actual reaction against it that the British had. So in this slide of the Bethesda fountain, you can see that they're in Central Park in New York. You can clearly see that there's two axes going through the Bethesda fountain, very formal and very axial. But in the background, what are you looking at? You're looking at a giant lake that is completely natural and has no, regular form. So what does that have to do with garden design in the Seattle area? Well, this is the largest garden that I ever designed. It's a 3-acre garden in Bellevue. And because the garden was large enough, I was able to incorporate both of those two different approaches to garden design. So there's a really strong axis. You can see the line that goes through the swimming pool, it goes through the house, it becomes the center of the auto court. But at the bottom of the pool is this very large sinuous lawn, which is really has no symmetry to it. It's completely natural or naturalistic, as the British would have. And so you can actually incorporate both of those styles of garden design in one garden if the property is large enough to allow that. Now I want to talk a little bit about post-war suburban design in this country. And I'm trying to move really fast because I've got a lot of ground to cover in a short time. There was a huge housing crisis after the First World War, which led, of course, to suburbanization. And it led to lots of new, platted neighborhoods with cul-de-sacs and things like that. And there were two practitioners of the post-war period that worked in Northern California primarily. They were Garrett Ekbo on the left and Tommy Church on the right. And I have given their dates because it's significant to me that Tommy Church was born 8 years before Garrett Ekbo. You can kind of see in his designs, there's more of a formalism that Ekbo kind of turned away from entirely. But Tommy Church wrote a book called Gardens Are for People. I have it in this bag if anyone wants to look at it afterwards. And Garrett Ekbo wrote a book called Landscape for Living. And Garrett Ekbo wrote this, which I think is very interesting. He's talking about landscape architects here when he says we. He says, small gardens are not seen as our highest aspiration. He means as landscape architects. If you can do a 50-acre park, it must be more important. But for me, the private garden has always been a laboratory for developing new ideas and concepts. Any family that has a quarter-acre backyard has got a real project. Any improvement in any space is a step forward. And he did these absolutely wonderful, quirky diagrams that I love. And in this diagram, he shows how you can bring the indoors in and you could bring the outdoors. You could bring the outdoors in and you could bring the indoors out. So what we see on the bottom is the typical kind of garden I was talking to you about before, where there are clearly 4 walls and an open ceiling. But what if you close the ceiling and you open the walls? So the garden design up above, there's actually a ceiling that the trees are growing up through, but the walls are completely open. They're just implied by the posts at the corners, and that brings the garden elements in. Now, because this was the post-war period in America, and we were designing the suburban neighborhoods, there were a lot of cul-de-sacs which made for a lot of really odd-shaped lots, and which I have certainly encountered in all the garden designs that I've done. So for example, on the bottom, there is a wedge-shaped garden where the street is close to the narrow end, and on the left, there's a wedge-shaped garden where the street is close to the wide end. And so Garrett Ekbo was playing around with how do you design gardens differently based on these strange lot shapes. Here's one of his designs, and you can see that it's very, it looks very random, very abstract. It's almost like an abstract expressionist painting of the same period. But there are certain things about it that stand out to help it be unified. And to me, the butterfly chair there, the way it relates to the triangular shapes on the edges of the paving, that really shows the mid-century modern style. This is a garden by Tommy Church, and you can see the point I made earlier, that it's maybe a little bit more restrained, a little bit more formal than what Garrett Ekbo was designing. But what I find so fascinating about it is that there was this open screen that he designed which goes beyond the corner of the house. He was actually delaying your progress as you move around the house from the side garden to the back garden. And by doing that, it actually makes the back garden feel much more intriguing. It brings this idea of mystery into the garden. So first you see the screen, and then you look through the screen, and then you think, oh, I can go around the screen to find this other room in the back. If that screen was not there, the garden would feel a lot less dynamic. His masterpiece was the Donald Garden in Sonoma, California, and there's a Henry Moore sculpture in the heart-shaped pool, and again the butterfly chairs that mimic the curves of that pool. And here's what it looks like today. It's one of the most beautiful garden designs ever done. Now, I talked a lot about Garrett Echo, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more. But let's talk about how you actually create the garden. What is the design process that you go through? Creating a space means erecting at least 3 walls. So here are diagrams I did. Picture on the left that you're somewhere out in the Great Plains. It's a flat landscape, and you can see for miles. Well, the railroad tracks disappear onto the horizon, and where they disappear to the point, that's called the vanishing point. The vanishing point of a one-point perspective, which was very important in the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, when artists actually rediscovered the ancient art of perspective that had been lost during the Middle Ages. If you were to erect one wall on the, let's say, on the side of the railroad tracks, you would not be creating a space. If you erected 2 walls, you're beginning to define a space, but if you have 3 walls, then you really have created the space, because obviously that's a little nook within this giant, undifferentiated plane. And so how does that really look with an actual garden design? Here's a garden design that my business partner, Bill Talley, and I did in the Blue Ridge neighborhood of Seattle about 20 years ago. And you can see all the elements I've been talking about. There's a clear x-axis through the door, a y-axis through the little patio. And if you look through the door, you'll see the vanishing point of the one-point perspective somewhere out there in what is Puget Sound. There are 3 walls, a wall to the left, a wall to the right, and the house is the 4th wall. Now, the 4th wall can sometimes be open, and this is what we call borrowed landscape. This is a garden design I did in Windermere. It was just finished in the last couple of years. And as you see, there is a wall on the left, actually a fence. You can't see it very clearly, but there's fences around the sides of that garden. The 3rd wall is the house, which is behind us. But the 4th wall is open, just like in a theater, the 4th wall would be open to the audience. Here it's open to the view of Lake Washington, which is obviously not owned by the client, and therefore we call it borrowed landscape. Garrett Ekbo, again, his quirky diagrams that I love. If you look at the one on the left, if you look at the top, some people were thinking, you know, it's time we spruced up our garden, so we're going to go out and we're going to get some trees, and we're going to plant those trees. But the people on the bottom, at the bottom house, were a little smarter. They said, no, we're actually going to think about this first. So as you can see, they have a plan out in the driveway. That plan is either measuring their site, or it's a plan by a professional landscape architect for what they're going to accomplish. And so then on the right, you see the people on the top have finished their work, but they're looking over their fence in envy at the people down below who hired a professional landscape architect. And you can see we have an indoor-outdoor space, a covered patio on the bottom. We have raised beds, we have a patio, we have all sorts of elements that were consciously designed. And so different people from the neighborhood are walking around and they're thinking, oh yeah, this is really great, we should do this. Well, how do you actually get there? In the design process, site analysis always precedes design. And this is a very simple example of site analysis from Garrett Ekbo. He shows that on this lot, there's a neighbor's house. On one side, there's a messy yard in the back. There's a nice yard on the bottom side, and there's a mud puddle, and so on and so forth. And he thinks about all of these things. I love the fact that he actually drew himself into the scene, scratching his head, and he's going, how am I going to design a garden for these people? Well, I have to bear in mind that the sun is beating down on this site, that they've got kids, they've got a dog, we got to put the garbage somewhere. It might be nice to sit in the house and look out at the garden, and can't forget that we need plants. Oh, and by the way, there's wind, and so wind may be a constraint to the types of plants we use. So then he creates a bubble diagram, and the bubble diagram is going to inform what the design actually becomes. There's a private park in the back, there's a patio, there's a quiet private garden in the front, and there's a public entrance on the lower left which also includes the driveway. This is not that same garden, but this is a terrific diagram he did showing how a hardscape defines the space. So on the upper picture, we see the structural skeleton of the garden, and it's very clearly defined with the walls and the floor. In the lower space, planting has enhanced it, and that's key. So basically, if your hardscape is defining the space, the plants can only enhance it. Now obviously, plants can also be used to define a space in the absence of any hardscape, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the few minutes remaining. But he has pictures of the before conditions, and the after condition on the bottom matches the sketch on the left. Here's one of the resulting gardens that he did. Shows that it's very consciously designed. Here's a garden, another one by Tommy Church. What I love about this image is the very rectilinear house, but the garden has curving lines. And so there's kind of a point-counterpoint between the rigid, rectilinear quality of the house and the curving lines in the garden. And this is how I dealt with that in one of my projects, which is one of my favorite projects I did, which is in the Mount Baker neighborhood in Seattle. And you see there's a koi pond with a walk over it, and there's a terrace. Everything is pretty rectilinear around the house, but there's a curve on this crushed rock walk that comes up. So, very quickly, hardscape elements define the space. Here's some hardscape elements from my designs, decks and paving, hardscape paving. This is very symmetrical paving on the left, and in fact, there was only one Japanese maple when I started the project, so we went out to Big Trees Nursery and bought the other one because I said to the client, you really have to have matching Japanese maples to emphasize the symmetry of that bedroom wing of the house. Steps, of course, are important when it's a sloping garden. Steps on a steeply sloping garden, and design of fences. This is a fence I designed that has some plexiglass panels at the entry to relieve the darkness and to show you that you're at the entry. Now, I don't have a lot of more time to talk, but I want to talk about one thing in particular, and that's screening, which also relates to the idea of plants as creating the space rather than hardscape. So this is a drawing for a garden that I designed over 20 years ago in North Capitol Hill. And in this particular property, there was no backyard at all. So we had to make the front yard, which is quite large, work the way a backyard would work. And the way we did that was to split the space into three. The central space is semi-private or semi-public, meaning that's where the guests come in, that's where the FedEx delivery man comes. Now it would be the Amazon guy. But on the right, we have an enclosed garden, which is their children's play area and basically their outdoor rec room. On the left, we have a much more formal garden, also enclosed, which is what would be used maybe when they're entertaining guests. And so here's how it turned out. On the left, you can see there was Leyland cypress hedges that were used instead of walls, instead of fences. And there's another Leyland cypress hedge on the picture on the right, which surrounds the more formal garden, and then the more private or semi-private garden is in the middle. I know, I got really dry when I talk. The last thing I want to talk about, because I think a lot of people are interested in this, is what kind of plants can you use for screening when you're not using walls, when you're not using fences? Well, one that I absolutely love to use that very few people know about is the European hornbeam. The image on the right is European hornbeam at the Rodin Museum in Paris. On the left, I don't know where that is. It's a slide I grabbed off the internet. But I particularly love it because this can grow as high as you want, and you can see how narrow it is when you trim it. it is deciduous, but during the winter, the twigs are so dense that it provides quite good screening in the winter as well. And I can't end this without mentioning that there is the Rhyopes plicata, or creeping lily turf, on the bottom of the left image. That's the fantastic grass substitute that landscape architects, including me, love to use. Italian cypress is also used for screening. And as you see in these images, it's very often spaced out a little bit, which makes it extremely attractive because they look like sentinels. But sometimes when we have to screen something very definitely, very carefully, we need to actually plant them back to back. And then lastly, this is another screen plant that I love to use, which is Pacific wax myrtle, another one that people haven't heard of. But it is very upright growing, as you can see on the left, and so it makes a very quick hedge. That hedge photo I don't particularly like, but it does show how it covers. So that's, I think, all the time I have. I'm just going to go to the very end of this, so you can have my, see, I had a much longer lecture prepared. If you go to the very end, I have my contact information. Well, it just goes on and on and on. Oh, I went past the, anyway, with that, I'd like to ask if you have any questions.
Well, you know, one thing that I had trouble with at my house, we bought it and it hadn't been tended to for 20 years. And was this foundation planning, because the house